Kris, thank you for your time. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining the podcast.
No, thanks for having me on, mate. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good to connect and have a chat. So currently in the US at Wake Forest University as the Assistant Director of Sports, but you've come across from the UK. What's that journey been like, transitioning from the United Kingdom system into the US system? What's your philosophies been like? How's that journey sort of shaped your philosophies?
Yeah, so I think obviously both systems are successful in their own right. I think the UK system obviously doesn't have as much of a base in terms of athletes to pull from. So the athletes that you do get, you've got to really nurture them and pretty much like monitor them throughout and be really careful in how you develop them, because there's not this huge pool. On the flip side, you've got this, like the pool in the US is much bigger. You can pull from, so it's almost like only the strong survive and the elite kind of make it to the NFL or the NBA or whatever it is. The system is very student style is adapted kind of slightly to those environments. I think I'm quite lucky almost as well with the sport I work in, being tennis for the most part. Those athletes kind of, generally speaking, kind of take quite well to that UK kind of European based system, and a lot of our players are from Europe anyway. But yeah, kind of, especially if you look at it from like the American football side, it's very much kind of a drill sergeant-esque approach to strength and conditioning, kind of taking orders, so to speak. Not necessarily my own, like something I've learned over the years is it's all about like the athlete. At the end of the day, we've got to really kind of forge those relationships with the athlete, and that's something that I've learned quite a lot over the last 3 years. I remember when I first got into the field, I'd think, oh, like, you're working with these great athletes, like they want to be there, they want to train, they want to do all of this stuff, they're super motivated. And then I got a bit of a shock to see that's just not the case. They want to play their sport, they want to be successful in their sport, but they don't want to necessarily lift weights. They don't want to do loads of running and stuff like that. So that was a little bit of a shock to me. I was like, like a few years ago, you just like to get this kind of slap in the face. Yeah, wow, well, I've got to kind of change what I'm trying to do here. So I suppose that comes down to my, philosophy, for lack of a better word, being based on a person-first approach. I think you've got to have that person-first approach and try and build those relationships with the athletes that you're working with, because if they don't buy into what you're doing or don't believe in you as a person, obviously forget the program. Then from that point of view, if we look actually towards like program design and actually kind of your program, your system, whatever you want to call it, then I look at the biomotor, bioenergetic, and the biodynamic demands of the sport, and then pretty much just work back from there. So do your in-depth analysis of the sport, identify what works, what doesn't, what do we need to kind of get to that final position of being elite, and then just work back to our current position. If that kind of might be a roundabout way of answering your question, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's good. So in your opinion, and you're welcome to sort of steer your answer towards tennis, but what does it mean to build a better athlete, to reach that elite performance?
I think first and foremost, you got to ask yourself the question, better at what? What are we actually trying to get better at? Because I know you said specifically potentially tennis there, but I think that's the first thing we've got to be able to identify. And now tennis is obviously a sport itself, but there's still different demands within tennis and different playing styles and things like that. So if I've got someone that's maybe a defensive baseliner, I don't necessarily need to train them exactly the same or develop technically and tactically the same qualities as someone who may be a bit more of an aggressive kind of 1-2 punch guy. So someone that has a big serve and they follow it up and try to finish the rally pretty quickly. So I think you've really got to understand the athlete you're working with. And then again, just to kind of go back on what I said before, understand the biomotor, the bioenergetic, and the biodynamic demands of the sport, and kind of build everything around that. So if you're looking to build a better athlete, first of all, understand the demands of the athletes you're working with, and then again work back from that. And if you look at the structure to do with reverse engineering, so to speak, then it's essentially define the sport demands. So tennis, kind of what are the demands? We talked about the biodynamic, bioenergetic, and the biomotor demands. Then within that, we need to define the end state of the elite athlete. So if our goal is to produce elite athletes on the national or international stage, what do they look like? What are the some qualities that they possess that our athletes don't have? Then we need to define the preparatory demands of those athletes. So what is the intensity, the density, the volume that these athletes are hitting kind of day to day, week to week, year to year? Like, what does that look like as an end state? So we're still looking down the line into the future at this point. Then I think we almost take a reality check. And then that's why I like to call it in terms of the reality check, because then we've got to look at the current athletes that we're dealing with. So what is the current state of our athletes? Now, some of them might be in phenomenal shape. They might be really good potential athletes. Some of them might not be. They might just be good, really good technically and tactically, and might not have the physical tools that we would like them to potentially have. So we go through this kind of problem solving process. And then essentially we're just looking to identify the various rate limiters in performance. So where are essentially the weak links, then how can we create a solution and put the athlete almost back together again, fill in the gaps in these weak links, while not taking away from their strengths. And I think too many coaches try to look at, oh, look, this is the weakness, this is the glaring weakness. They don't have X, Y, and Z quality. And they're almost blinded by the light of the weakness instead of actually focusing on the strength. Like the strength's the reason they're there in the first place. So you've really got to focus on sharpening the sword, and then trying to bring the weakness up bit by bit so it's not a glaring weakness.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of, it's not going to get exposed maybe as it did to start with, and then maybe the weakness eventually just becomes something that's not that apparent, but our strengths are still our strengths. If our speed is one of our strengths, then we need to keep pushing on the speed aspect. If it's our technical or tactical ability, your kind of ability to see the game, maybe like a Paul Scholes, for those kind of that maybe know Manchester United back in the day in the 90s, that unbelievable technical and tactical ability. He had to spray the ball around the field and see people running. Like, that's what he needs to get even better at, not necessarily some of the other qualities that maybe he may have been lacking in. So that's kind of the approach that I take if we're looking to build a better athlete. And I think it's, like I say, those different stages that we go through are going to be very important. When you're looking to design your kind of solution to the problem, or what we typically call program design, that's obviously going to be highly individual to you as a coach, and the equipment, technology, amount of staff, the culture that you've got kind of within your organization. So that's going to be highly individual as well. So if I was to say, oh, this is what we do here at Wake Forest with my tennis team, that might not, I could give you the exact plan of what I did to reverse engineer my sport, my program design, and I could send it to you, and it probably wouldn't work in your environment, because the equipment you have available might be completely different. Your culture might be completely different. Obviously, your sport is different for a start. And I think even if you were to do it inter-sport between a university and the US, it probably wouldn't work. You still got to know the athletes that you work with and kind of what their goals are and things like that. And like I say, all of these different variables that come together as a piece of the puzzle. Yeah,
for sure. There's that saying that's going around where content is king, but context is God. And I quite like that, just in the sense that you've got to have that background knowledge and understanding of everything that we do, but you've got to apply it to the specific context that you're in. And if you can do that well, then I think you're probably going to have more success, as opposed to just applying content that you've taken from a different context and trying to get the same results.
Definitely. And I think almost the thing for that is, at the moment, people just seeing stuff on, like, let's just say Instagram, and they're like, oh, that exercise looks fantastic, let's use it in my environment. It's like, but you don't know the 5 years of previous development that athlete's used to get to that stage. And that's why I'd never try and say, oh, this guy here, he's got a bad program. You can't judge anything or anyone, I don't think, on a 15-second Instagram context that everything's in, essentially. You've got to understand everything that's kind of going on, like looking under the hood, as I talk about it. Like if you're just looking at the car, hey, it looks like a nice car. It's a Ferrari, but it might have the engine of a Peugeot 206 inside it. Like you just don't know exactly what's going on.
100%.
And I think one of the biggest things I've learned is just don't jump to conclusions. Don't kind of, just because maybe someone's got a different line of thinking than you might be the Olympic lifting guy, but then this other guy completely hates Olympic lifting but gets good results, or maybe doesn't get good results. Like, just don't jump to conclusions. Actually ask the question, why? And be critical in your thinking around that. And I think people these days, and like I'm guilty of this myself at times, we're not critical enough in the lines of thinking that we have, and asking ourselves why. And then asking yourself why is okay, but then I think you need another few whys on top of that. If just to really kind of get into the weeds of the conversation and sit in asking coaches, other performance coaches, get uncomfortable in trying to understand what your sport is about or what your industry is about. And like, I don't have all the answers, and that's why I try to reach out to people that are smarter than me, and people that do have the answers. And I think trying to understand that, and I think it's a very humbling moment that you realize, oh wow, I'm just in this huge sea of sports performance, and there's so many various aspects of performance, and the body is like, doctors don't like, that's the thing as well. At the moment, we're becoming more and more specialized. We're almost becoming a little bit like kind of doctors in their field, but then we're putting this onus on ourselves to understand everything to do with the human body. Yeah. And I think we almost need to take a step back and just say, look, it's okay to not know something. You've got to have the hunger and thirst for knowledge. But if we look at doctors, they're becoming more and more specialized in their field. They started out as kind of like general practitioners and things like this, and now you've got people that are specialists that are going into like heart surgery and even specific parts of kind of vascular surgery and stuff like this. And I think the big thing is it's okay to not know stuff. I had this conversation with a friend a month or so ago, and it's like, he was saying he actually feels almost pressured, especially with the Instagram kind of race for knowledge and people putting all this content out. And it's just, get away from Instagram, get away from all this stuff and kind of look at reality. Are you impacting the team and the individuals around you with the knowledge that you've currently got? Because as Joel Smith says, you don't know what you don't know. And that's okay. Let's not take offense at that. And let's just, if you think there's something you maybe don't know and it's going to impact your current practice, let's learn about it. And let's kind of get digging a little bit that way. But I think too often we're kind of too quick to jump on the bandwagon and not have enough context in everything that we do to truly understand everything. I don't know if that was a rant or not, but we kind of...
No, it's good. It's good. I mean, there's so many things in there that I want to jump onto, but it's like, you almost, there's a sort of culture where we aren't allowed to be vulnerable. It's like we have to know everything. And my feeling is just like we need to try and be a little bit more honest with ourselves and portray that vulnerability in order to grow. Then that's sort of my sort of mindset and thinking in terms of trying to develop. And then also just remaining curious, asking questions all the time. Like remaining curious about yourself. So how are you doing things? But then being curious about what other people are doing as well, and trying to understand, like you said, the context more than the content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's kind of what it comes down to at the end of the day. Just being curious and that thirst for knowledge.
Yeah.
And as long as you're trying to better yourself, I don't think anyone can really say anything bad of you, because you're trying to get better. And that's like, my girlfriend says to me regularly, like, did you do your best? Like, did you kind of give it your all in this session or whatever it was? I'm like, yeah, I did. And it's like, well, that's all that matters. And if you gave your best at that time in that place, then you did a good job. And then you can learn from those experiences, even if it wasn't seen as like the best experience in the world. You can learn from that experience, and the next time it'll be even better. And then hopefully, just like we do in the weight room or whatever, it's progressive overload. It's exactly the same with learning, just progressive overload, a little bit more, little and often, and we get there eventually.
Yeah.
We get there in the end.
Yeah. So we're constantly chasing this thing of high performance. What does high performance actually mean? Like how do we know that we've actually reached that state of high performance?
That's a big question. I think it's funny. I've actually talked about this a little bit with a few people recently. And I think high performance is often misunderstood in terms of people thinking they're high performance, but not really understanding what high performance is. Now, this is just my opinion, and my opinion will obviously differ to what other people feel it is. But I think a lot of people think high performance is spreadsheets, fancy charts and graphs, pivot charts and stuff like this that make us look and feel really intelligent. And don't get me wrong, those things are very important because we love our printouts and we can hand those to coaches. And everyone loves that printout when it comes off and you've got your like acute to chronics or whatever, and you can look at your training load charts and it looks impressive when you look at it. But for me, it's not necessarily high performance. It's something to do with high performance or a performance program. But if we think that high performance is classed as, we've checked the box of high performance because we've got all these fancy charts and pivot tables and everything else, I think we're missing the point. Because if you can't communicate with the person just down the hallway in the office, or if you can't speak with the athletic trainer or the physios, then you're not high performance. There's nothing high performance about your system. So for me, it comes down to high performance is all about communication and collaboration. And it doesn't matter how good of technology you've got, the budget you've got, or anything. If you don't collaborate and communicate with your team members, then you're never going to be able to win anything. It's going to be like the system that you're putting in place is going to be unsustainable. So that's why I wrote on my board the other day, we like foster and force communication. And I think you've got to be able to do that in the positions that we're in. We've got to know, obviously, we're in the people game, essentially. We've got to know how to work and not necessarily manipulate people, but kind of manipulate people to the line that we're thinking or we can learn from them. But I think it's about having those open and honest conversations. And everyone's not going to agree with what you say, and that's absolutely fine. But I think if you can be humble enough to admit, like we talked about just before, that you don't know everything, and you can actually go and speak with the coach down the hallway that, look, coach, maybe like X, Y, and Z isn't going that well, or this is what I've seen as maybe some trending data and stuff like this. It doesn't necessarily, you can't just print out a piece of paper and just hand it to them and say, oh, coach, this is what I'm seeing. You've got to be able to have those conversations. And something that I try to push for is, like, we do our weekly performance meetings, and I try to limit it to like a 20 to 30 minute meeting. And I put, at the moment, we're all the tennis centers off campus. So we do it through Zoom. And that was something that I think has worked pretty well. Obviously, Zoom's pretty common these days, but doing it through Zoom. And then one thing I actually do during those meetings, I make sure I do it as I stand up. So I have like a stand-up meeting almost with myself, because I feel, and I know there's some research in this as well. If you sit down and have a meeting, then you're pretty likely to switch off relatively quickly and not concentrate as much. So those meetings, I make sure I'm standing up because then I can drive the agenda. So I try and drive the agenda in those meetings. I have a checklist that I want to work through. And then if anyone else has got anything that they need to bring up, whether it's like physios or the coaches, I've got my checklist generally that I want to run through anyway. And I make sure we go through that checklist. Everyone's kind of paying attention to what's going on. And then we can kind of wrap it up within that maximum 30 minutes. I never want it to run over 30 minutes. And then in and around that, we have our kind of actual stand-up meetings, which last kind of anywhere from 3 to 7 minutes, where we catch each other in the hallway, we catch each other at the tennis center, on the court, in the weight room, but just before the lift, and just little updates and things like that as well. And I think having a communication strategy, for me, that's high performance.
Yeah.
It's not about the pieces of paper and the documentation and things like that. It's more about actually having your communication strategy, understanding as a team how you communicate, how often you communicate, and what terminology you use. Yeah. One of the first things I did when I came to Wake was actually understand the terminology we use as a coaching staff.
Okay.
So we sat down and we went through, okay, so these are the movement patterns I'm seeing on the court. And like, I've worked in tennis for a little bit now, so I understand. But then around the world, people use different terminology. So we made sure we had our library of exercises use the same terminology. So when they're coaching their session on the court, they're using the exact same terminology I'm using when I'm talking about a movement session or something in the weight room and things like this. So we can all be singing off that same hymn sheet. So we're all kind of tied together. And then everything all of a sudden, if you start using the terminology in the weight room that the coach is using on the court, it just makes things just click a little bit better for the athlete. And it's like, oh, right, coach was on about that earlier, and now you're talking about it now. It must be right. Or you understand kind of what's happening on the court and things like that as well. So I think having your kind of chickens or ducks in a row, or whatever the saying is, I think is very important. And I think for me, high performance starts with communication, and it finishes with the kind of fancy pieces of paper and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. Having that common language, I think, is so important. Just creates that, like you said, everyone just sort of working in the same direction, and also trying to make that link between sort of what you're doing currently to where you're trying to get the athlete to in the future, which is going to lead to that elite performance eventually.
Yep, definitely, 100%. And it's like I said, it's about the athlete at the end of the day. It's their journey. You've got to let them own it. So that's what I try to have. I have conversations every day, like with the athletes, one-on-one situations if I can, even if it's just a 20-second conversation. It's just understanding, just, hey, how you doing? How was last night? How did you find this session? And then some stuff as well, like that's not relevant to tennis, just general chit chat, you know. And I think the more we can understand, actually, it's the athlete's journey. It's not ours. Yeah. It's not about us. It never has been. It's all about them. Then I think the better off we can be as a coach, as an educator, and then as a profession as well. Yeah.
I remember I worked with a coach, one of my previous coaches, head coach, and he actually had one of his daily sort of things that he had to do was that he had to have a conversation with every single athlete on our roster. And you'd actually have a checklist. So every time he'd had a conversation with an athlete, you'd go and tick it off. And yeah, so we had like 33, 35, 40 athletes on our roster. And every single day he made an effort to have a conversation, whether it was, like you said, a 20-second or whether it was a 5-minute, 10-minute conversation. He was connecting with every single athlete every single day.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's the stuff that you're not taught in school and things like that. And that's the stuff that really makes the difference at the end of the day. Like I try and make sure I speak to my tennis teams and I go around and speak to everyone individually during the session, in one way or another. Like I say, it doesn't have to be a long conversation. And then if I've got a slightly larger team, like I'm currently working with the throwers here, so it's a slightly larger team that we've got in there. So I walk around the room, again, having the conversations, and then just making sure like I'm knocking out some fist bumps or whatever it will be, just to make sure we've got that connection. Yeah. And I think they really understand that as well. And if they're maybe doing an exercise, kind of just jumping in after they've got the exercise, kind of that's when you give them their cues and stuff like that, and have a little bit of your conversation and just ask them how the day's been going. And I think Brett Bartholomew's done a great job with this in terms of his kind of understanding the terminology behind coaching and understanding your athletes. But I think that when I was kind of coming through university, my undergrad and my master's, that wasn't something that was ever talked about. No. So I came out not really knowing, and I know I talked about earlier, like I thought it was just the sets and the reps. When I first started, I thought it was all about the sets and the reps, and kind of that was it. And athletes were athletes, and like I said, they wanted to lift weights, get better, and be elite. Nope, that wasn't the case. So yeah, that's kind of been a big learning curve for me over the past kind of 5 years, I suppose. And no, it's been an enjoyable one as well.
Yeah. Just diving a little bit deeper into, you mentioned it before, just the reverse engineering, the demands of a sport, and how we use that concept, or why that concept is becoming more and more sort of spoken about in terms of developing our athletes. I know you are going down the rabbit hole a little bit with the concept, so maybe you could provide a little bit more information about what you found, and then also how you use that concept in your preparation of your athletes.
Yeah, so I think reverse engineering is becoming a more and more popular term. And I think, like, if we look at it at face value, it's essentially just a needs analysis. We do a needs analysis of the sport, but I think a needs analysis maybe doesn't go into enough detail and kind of give you the system to work with, even though essentially it is a needs analysis. Like I say, if we look at it, reverse engineering is probably a sexier term. So people will probably start reverse engineering their sport a little bit more because it sounds cooler than a needs analysis. It doesn't sound quite as businessy maybe or something like that. But yeah, and like I went through that kind of the checklist approach that I do with my sport, but I think every coach needs to be able to do that and understand the demands of their sport, especially like no matter the level you're working with. So find out what are the level of, so I work with tennis. So if I'm working with an under 14s player versus a college player versus a pro player, the demands of those, even though it's the same sport, the demands of the actual, I suppose, sport itself is actually going to be different. And we need to understand that and appreciate that. And we can't just take it at face value. And that's where I talk about looking under the hood a little bit more. Like we can see it's from a distance, it's tennis. Mm. But if you look under the hood, there's so many different things that are happening. And that's where we go through kind of like defining the sport demands. What's the end state? Or the elite state of the athlete that we're maybe trying to get to? Or what is the, if we're the under 14s, kind of what does the under 18 player or under 16 player look like? And I think the lower you go down the tree, so to speak, and more youth development, and there's a lot more moving parts and things like that as well, which is important to understand. But then understanding, once we kind of understand what the elite athlete looks like, or the goal essentially, then we need to look at the preparatory demands, work through those, like intensities, densities, volumes that we talked about, define the current state. So come back to reality. What's the actual reality of the situation we're dealing with? And then you diagnose the problem, identify the limiting factors. So my DEAC test that I created was a kind of my way of, to an extent, reverse engineering the sport and just creating a fitness test or a conditioning test that's more specific to the sport. And I don't know if you want me to get into any detail about that, about the DEAC test or anything, but we need to, I think, generally speaking, a lot of tests are not kind of, they don't necessarily assess the sport. And it's really tough because you can go two ways with testing. You can try and go really specific and really get the nitty gritty of identifying the different rate limiters in performance and down almost to not quite necessarily a cellular level, but you can go as deep as you want if you've got the technology available. And that's almost what we're taught in terms of your VO2 max testing and things like this when we're at university. But what's the actual practicality and applicability of a VO2 max test in the real world? I can tell you on one hand how many times I've done VO2 max tests since I left university. Big fat zero. So what's the actual, so what are we actually learning this stuff for at university? Like I know what you're learning it for because you've got some people that want to become researchers. But I think on the flip side of the coin, you've got to appeal to the people that want to work. I'd say probably the vast majority of people that want to work in kind of the real world where we don't have Douglas bag gas analysis and stuff like this, and be able to come up with tests that are appropriate. So then you get people running like the mile, Cooper tests and stuff like this, which again are fine tests. Like they do the job if you wanted to pull kind of maximal aerobic speed and stuff like this from it. If that's your jam, fine, go for it. But then I want to look again a little bit deeper at the demands of the sport. So what I did with the DEAC test is look at the demands of the sport. So we pull up the charts of kind of what are the work to rest ratios, what's the distance covered, how many change directions are we hitting, what's the usual kind of the average distance covered per point, how many points are in a game, how many games, how much time do we get between games, between change of ends, between sets, and stuff like this, kind of just essentially just going down the rabbit hole. And then when you come back to it, you've got all this data and then you just put it into a test. So I identified from this data that in tennis, the average college point length in men's tennis is 6.36 seconds. So, and then the rest between points is 20 seconds. So funny enough, I set the test up to be 7 seconds. I rounded up instead of rounding down. 7 seconds work, 20 seconds rest. So it's really, when you talk about it, when you talk it through like this, it's really simple. But then you look again, okay, well, what's the distance covered? What's the change directions? So the average number of change directions per point in tennis, or college tennis especially, is 3. So we're looking at 3 change directions per point. Okay, well, our test will have 3 change directions. So that's what we did. We go from the doubles alley, from the doubles line to the center line, back to the doubles alley for our second change and then we sprint across to the far doubles line for our third change direction, and then they sprint back to the start position. And the goal is to cover as much distance as possible in that time. So we've used our information from our needs analysis or reverse engineering, whatever you want to call it. We've used our research and we've actually applied it. So we're working for 7 seconds, resting for 20, which is real world. That's what's going to happen on the court. We're going to hit 3 changes of direction at maximal outputs. Now, I think a lot of tests don't necessarily do this. So a classic test in tennis is to run the mile. It's a very linear test in nature. Okay, running one way around the track, it's continuous. There's no change of directions or anything like this. Like, that's not tennis. So why are we using this as a test for tennis? And to me, that just doesn't make sense. And I looked at this test and a few other tests that I run within tennis, and I reached out to a lot of college coaches saying, look, what are your tests that you do? Just out of interest. And I got some feedback, and I kind of came up with the tests they do. And there was like 300-yard shuttles in there, Cooper runs, mile test, yo-yos, and stuff like this. And none of them really tested the output of the athlete and the asymmetries of the athlete. So that was something I decided to dig into. And then as well, I missed out something there in terms of actually setting up the test. So we do 14 reps. Now we do 14 reps because there is a maximal in college tennis. There's a maximum number of points you can do per game. So you can do 7 points in one game because there's a deuce point and it's kind of a sudden death point. So you're capped at 14 before you get a 90-second rest between kind of changeovers. So that's kind of the information we put in there. So we did a 14-rep test. They changed direction 7 times off their right leg, 7 times off their left leg. From this, we can actually have more information. If we look at the mile, the only thing is that you're getting from it potentially is maximum aerobic speed. But a lot of coaches don't even do that, and they just pull the data they're pulling is essentially pass or fail. Did you run sub 530 or above 530? Oh, I was above 530, coach. Oh, well, you got to do it again. And then it gets ridiculous, and it's like, oh, you're going to do it again tomorrow. And it's like, well, he ran a 6-minute mile. Like, he's not knocking 30 seconds off in a day. But that's another conversation. But then, so you're only getting one piece of important information there. Whereas the test I created, I'm not saying this test is perfect by any means. I'm appreciating the feedback that coaches are giving me at the moment and things like that. It's just helping the test get better, in my opinion. But we can pull more data from this one test that takes 6 minutes, 18 seconds than we can from longer tests than yo-yos, which take 20 to 30 minutes and actually beat up the kids. Like, the residual fatigue carries over, in my opinion, if you're using like loads of change directions, accumulating 2,500 meters, or whatever level you get to, it just beats up the hips. Kids are sore for 2 or 3 days, and then you're impacting the technical and tactical development, which is essentially, in my opinion, should be the goal of the program, because that's the stuff that really makes the difference. So the DEAC test looks at best rep, worst rep. So best rep will be most distance covered in any of the 14 reps. Usually you see it in the first 1 to 2 reps. Worst reps, obviously least distance covered. We look at total distance covered, the capacity of the system, versus your best rep, which is your alactic output. So essentially your speed. Mm-hmm. Then we can also, on top of that, since they do 7 off the left, 7 off the right, they alternate left to right. So the first rep will be every change direction. 3 times will be right, right, right. The second rep will be left, left, left. By the end of it, then we can compare the distance covered on the left leg versus distance covered on the right leg. And then we've got our asymmetry data. We can say, okay, well, he doesn't change very well efficiently here, or whatever it might be. His outputs are down on his left versus his right. That gives us something else to look at. And then the other piece that we look at is the fatigue index, which people jump on the fatigue index way too soon, in my opinion. That's fourth or fifth down the list. People just see it as, oh, you're fatiguing, you're going from whatever score to something else. You've got a decrement of like 6% versus this person's got a decrement of 3%. And that's, I think it's, people jump on that a little bit too soon. And the fatigue index is almost irrelevant if you don't have the outputs to start with. Yeah. So I had someone that's got a decrement of 3%. On the face of it, coaches are looking at that and like, oh, this is fantastic. Like, she's in great shape. I'm like, yeah, but he or she cannot cover like the required amount of distance per rep that we actually set as an average score or term to be good. So I don't care how many times if we look at it in tennis terms, I don't care how many times you can't get to the drop shot. I just need you to be able to get to the drop shot on the first time. And then once you've got the output ability, then we'll look to repeat it for 14 times. So if you're slow, you're just kind of slower for longer. We need to actually get that output ability. And then the final piece of the puzzle with the test is I actually record the test, and then I review the film, and then I look at each individual athlete's how they actually change direction. What patterns do they use? How do they load coming in and out of each direction? Is there something that we can look at as part of our change direction progressions? Do I need to kind of address something as a team, or just maybe pull one person aside as an individual? And I think essentially as well, that helps us build our program in the weight room. By looking at this, we can see, okay, well, your change direction, you don't use a very efficient pattern, or you're taking way too long in this cut. Are you weak, eccentrically or isometrically? And these are the questions that we can start asking versus someone that just can pop in and out of the change direction. Now, I've just listed off 6 different things there, I think 6, that can help go towards my program design. Whereas if we come back to the mile or a half Cooper or whatever you want, that's giving you one piece of information realistically at the most, which is maximal aerobic speed. Now, I don't know how valuable maximal aerobic speed realistically is. So that's kind of how I used the information of the sport to inform, to create a test and then inform practice from the test. And I think that's really important. It's often overlooked. I think people see fitness testing. This is the gripe I have with kind of conditioning or fitness testing, is people see it as you need to be pushing to your upper limits. You need to puke. And for me, that's just not the case. It's more about what's it going to inform me of my practice? How can I inform my program design, and what can I understand from the athlete with the minimum cost to the athlete?
Yeah, for sure. And are you using any GPS to track your players during training or matches? And can you link their performance in your DEAC test to what they're actually sort of achieving in an actual game match?
So currently not, in terms of GPS and things like that. GPS in tennis is pretty rare. I think there's only on the ATP tour alone, so the men's professional tour, I think there's only 2 or 3 pro players actually using GPS. Okay. So it's something I'm looking at the moment, which I would like to do. I'd like to say, okay, well, look, if you're getting this output on the DEAC test, then it kind of correlates to this on the court. At the moment, I'm just looking at, okay, well, what are my outputs relative to my playing level? Okay. So college tennis, you play 1 through 6. Typically, your best player will play 1. And then we can look at the national rankings as well. And this is where coaches have been great. They've been feeding the results back from their various tests, along with kind of performance testing data, and then ranking them as well, like where they play in their lineup, and as well as national rankings. So what we're looking at is, okay, well, are the best players in the country, are they covering more distance per rep? Or are they covering less distance potentially per rep, but they're more consistent with it? Balanced left to right leg, what's the actual kind of data looking like? And I haven't really dug into the data yet. It's just kind of still very much in its infancy and coming in. But they're the questions that we're trying to ask. Is there actually any correlation between performance in the DEAC test and performance on the court? because I think, in my opinion, if you're to have a good test, then there should be some sort of predictive value between the actual performance test and the playing test. Now, we know the playing is the real test, but in theory, the closer we can bridge that gap, I think the better we're going to be as a performance industry. And I think at the moment, some of the tests that we do don't really do that.
Yeah. Who performs sort of first on the DEAC test, is he also performing the best in the competitive game in terms of his outputs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the more we can correlate that to the field, which, like I say, is the end goal, then the better off we're going to be as a coach, as an industry, or as a team. And I don't necessarily have the answers for that yet, and I don't know if any coach truly has those answers. I think that's kind of maybe the golden chalice that we're all chasing. Like, if there's a increase in performance in X, is there an increase in Y as well, or whatever it may be? And those positive correlations are obviously what we're looking at. And I know, like, Bondarchuk's searched that stuff for years, and got 3 books on it, I believe. But I think if we can do that, then we're obviously going to be in a better position. And I've got a very small data set at the moment. So if I was to jump to conclusions on my data, I don't think I'd be doing it justice.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't necessarily want to talk about the data that I've got at the moment, but I think the more data I can collect over the year or the years, then we'll be in a better position to say, okay, well, these players, and especially playing styles, this is something that we've looked at quite a lot as well, is do certain playing styles perform better at the test?
Okay.
So someone that's a defensive baseliner who needs to have good lateral movement and be able to decelerate efficiently in and out of the corners and be very kind of fit or conditioned to be able to do that, and high resistance to fatigue, in theory, a defensive baseliner should be there or thereabouts in topping your charts in kind of distance covered and hopefully a minimum fatigue index. Whereas if you compare that to like the 1-2 punch guy, so anyone that kind of listens to watches tennis, like a Del Potro, someone with a big serve, and can follow it up within a few shots, kind of a forehand or backhand, and finish the shot within finish the point within 4 shots, they would be the guy that, in my opinion, would have higher alactic outputs. So they would really push really well on the first few reps, but then I have a higher fatigue index overall. And then the offensive baseliner, I think, sits somewhere in between. I'm not fully sure on the exact profile of what they would have yet, but that's just kind of what I've typically like been seeing, and my thoughts around the different play styles and stuff like that as well. But yeah, the offensive baseline is typically kind of your Federers and stuff like that, the guys that really can control a rally and have got everything at the end of the day. So yeah, I think the more we can create a test that actually represents the sport and the sporting demands, as we talked about with our reverse engineering, and then predict or potentially predict performance from it, then I think we're going to be in a much better position to inform our practice, like in the weight room, on the court, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. It sounds like it's going to give you a lot of good data and a lot of good information. Like you said, information that's going to be able to affect your program positively, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's, are we informing practice? Are we using this data to inform our practice? If so, fantastic. That's really good. Let's keep doing it. If we're not using the data, if it's just going to sit there on a shelf, then we may as well just not do the test, because what's it really telling us? Yeah. If it's just a pass-fail test, like, oh, that's fantastic, you're fit enough, I suppose, to play tennis, but are you really? Because what is fitness? Is fitness like a VO2 max test? Is it like a sprint? Is it kind of, are we looking at certain qualities like VO2 kinetics and things like this, which I think you can actually, some of those qualities you can pull from the DEAC test as well, if you kind of dig into it and understand kind of how the body works enough. Or are we actually running conditioning tests which are actually applicable to our sport and it can inform program design on a large scale?
Yeah. What role do you place on weight training in your sort of holistic programming for a tennis player?
It really, so my girls will typically do at the moment, they're in the weight room 5 days a week. I use a microdosed approach. So they're doing 30-minute sessions post-practice with me. Is it the be-all and end-all for a tennis player? No. It's important, though. That's not to take away from it. I think as long as and this is where we have some really good conversations with our coaching staff, you've got to understand the technical, tactical, physical, and psychological elements of the sport. Once you can understand that, then the better position you're going to be in as a coach to inform practice again. So again, it comes back to that reverse engineering. What's important to the athlete? If I've got someone that's a very aggressive player, like an offensive baseliner, that may be quite limited in their footwork, then, or is potentially quite heavy anyway, then maybe more weight training is not going to be beneficial to them. And I think the weight training, like I say, it's important. It builds robustness. It builds our foundation for force production. But then what we've got to remember, and this is kind of something I've seen I've been thinking about over the last few years, and it's really showed recently, kind of coming out of quarantine and things like this, coming out of lockdown, is how important is strength. Like, I think strength's important. Force is important because we know it's going to improve our ability to produce force. But then we've really got to be able to produce force in finite amounts of time. So if you can squat 275 pounds, that's fantastic, and that's a pretty good weight for a tennis player. But is that actually beneficial if you can't apply that force in a certain given time? Will it help build robustness? Sure, it will. But is there other ways of building robustness that we don't have to have the exact same axial loading and things like that? Like, yes, I think there are. So these are all the questions that I'm asking myself. And I think the biggest thing for me is, I think strength's overrated across all sports, if I'm honest with you. I'm not saying, like, don't interpret this wrong. Don't say I don't care about strength, because I think it's very much sport dependent. So if I was to say American football, do you need to be strong? Or rugby, do you need to be strong? Yes, you need to have high levels of strength. But for other sports, it's all relative to the demands of your sport that you're going to face. And I think that was almost proven to me with the results I got of the girls coming out of lockdown. Every one of them PR'd on their jump tests and their more power-oriented explosive tests. And they didn't touch a barbell or a weight for the most part for 5 months, which is unbelievable. All we did was lots of jumping, lots of sprinting, hopping, bounding, like that type of stuff. And they're all hitting PRs on their kind of lower body, what we look at typically for our power metrics and stuff like that. So, like, for me, that's more important than having a fantastic bench press, a fantastic squat, trap bar deadlift, whatever it may be. Like, I've got the data that give us an idea of what a trap bar deadlift needs to have, but I just don't think what once thought they were. And that's, again, something that I wish I knew 5 years ago coming out of school. I think if we chase the numbers for the wrong reasons because it makes us feel good, because we can quantify that, yeah, we can tap ourselves on the back and say, hey, we've done a fantastic job. We got this guy or girl stronger. It's like, yeah, but to what end? Like, did it take away from the technical or tactical or psychological abilities within the sport? And if it did, then we haven't actually improved them as an athlete. So I think they're the questions that you've got to keep asking yourselves. And I ask myself all the time, is what we're doing here good? Is it beneficial to the athlete? So, like I said, we're microdosing at the moment, and our athletes are only doing 2 sets of everything they do. The main lifts are 2 sets of 5 reps. But people might look at me like, oh, you're crazy, like, you 10 reps. But they're still getting stronger. They feel the healthiest they've ever been. And they said, like, coming back from lockdown, that's one of the few chances they'll get in their career to take advantage of those newbie gains again. So why not jump on that bandwagon and ride it till the wheels fall off, until we have to add an extra set or intensity or whatever it might be, volume. Let's just keep with 2 sets of 5 or 2 sets of 10, depending on the type of lift we're doing or whatever it is, and just develop it accordingly for the tennis player, because they spend a lot of time on their feet on the court, just supplemental around that. So I see my job as more of a performance manager, making sure that they're getting what they need on the court. Are we hitting the appropriate intensities, but are they getting the right technical and tactical development they need on the court as well? And that's the conversation that I'm having with coaches. Like, we're very comfortable having those conversations. What are they seeing on court that maybe I'm not, in certain movement patterns and things like this? And how can I influence that in the weight room as well, and as part of our kind of speed and movement progressions?
Just to start closing off, a couple of questions. Just any 3 non-negotiables that you have in athlete development?
I think so. Some of the things that we talk about, for the most part, and I'm very lucky, the groups I work with are fantastic, and I don't really have an issue with this, but like timing. So you've got to be on time. Effort, just give me 100%, everything you do. You're only in here for 30 minutes. All right. So give me everything you've got for 30 minutes. And then attitude, just bring a positive attitude every day, and you'll be successful. And I think the important thing is, and I think I wouldn't say it's easy to get buy-in from these things, but we've been very, I suppose, lucky maybe with the group of athletes we've got, is they're the stuff that takes zero talent. You can be the most talented kid or the least talented kid in the world, and if you can't do those things, we've got probably bigger issues. So those things are really easy to do. You don't need loads of money or any money to be able to do it. So I think they're important. And then for me, the other thing is enjoyment. I want you to enjoy it. Yeah. And I constantly ask myself at the end of every session, like, did I enjoy that session? First and foremost, because if I didn't enjoy the session, then the kids definitely didn't enjoy the session. Because bearing in mind, I'm the guy that loves lifting weights and stuff like this. So if I didn't, they didn't. And then I ask myself, did they enjoy the session? And I actually ask them as well, like, just different questions, not necessarily, did you enjoy it? But like, how was today? Like, kind of what's been going on? Just different questions. And I think just enjoyment, and we take our jobs very seriously, and rightly so. But I think just chill out a little bit. We're here to have a good time as well. And if you're stressed like through your eyeballs and things like that because of different things, and don't get me wrong, like, performance is important, and we like to win as much as anybody. And I think we do a pretty good job, like, with the results on the field or the court for the most part. But you've got to enjoy what you do. If you don't enjoy what you do, like, you're not going to come to work every day and work the long hours that we do. So I think, they're my main things: kind of timing, effort, and attitude for the kids. And then overriding kind of principle is enjoyment. And that kind of came from, well, my goal for, I suppose, this goal came in 2 years ago for myself, was because we know what it's like as strength conditioning coaches. We take a lot of warm-ups, and warm-ups can get a little bit monotonous and things like this. So I had 15 minutes at the start of every session for our warm-up, and then depending on the theme of the day, whether we do kind of linear speed, lateral speed, reactive stuff, like whatever it is, my goal was the athlete needs to leave my session with a smile on their face. So something as simple as that changed the way I looked at everything. And if they weren't leaving with a smile on my face, I had to ask the question, like, why did I not finish this session? Like, we can get some of our more technical movement stuff done, but finish with some sort of fun game or whatever it is. And that, I think, that initial, I used to hate the word fun as well. And I sound a bit like the Grinch or something here, but when I first started off, I used to hate the word fun. And again, it comes back to this thing where I thought all athletes were just there to want to get better all the time, and just no matter what, they were going to do it because they wanted to be elite. And this just wasn't the case. Like I say, I wish someone had told me this when I first started in this field. So now my almost priority is enjoyment and fun. I want them to have fun, because if they're enjoying being in that environment, there's going to be more learning go on. And if there's more learning going on, there's going to be more adaptation going on. And if there's more adaptation, obviously there's more development, and things like this. And if there's more development, then it's a better place to be. If there's no adaptation and there's no learning, then what's the point in me being there? So we've got to create the atmosphere, create the, essentially that kind of, not culture necessarily, but create an enjoyable environment for us to be in as coaches, as athletes, so we can learn, we can adapt, we can develop as a team.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that enjoyment factor is so important. Like you want the athletes coming in every day, getting the work done, and ensuring that they're getting better as well, just through the process, through the environment that you've created, not necessarily through always using games to try and bring that element of fun in, because then I think we're seen as the guy that's, we're entertaining them as opposed to trying to actually enhance their athletic abilities. So for me, I think a lot of it's got to do with the actual environment that we create around them. Do they actually enjoy coming into that environment on a daily basis?
Yeah, and I think you're 100% right there. We're not entertainers. We've still got a job to do and to develop the physical qualities of the athlete. But I think there's different ways to obviously motivate the athletes as well. And when it comes to some of the things, it may be something like, look, we'll put you on the gram, so to speak, if you can hit like 5 or 10 chin-ups in a row, or just something as simple as that. I'm not saying that's something that we do, but that could just be an idea. And I think it's important to record, rank, and publish your data to your athletes. So how did we do on the DEAC test? Well, let's record. We've recorded it. Let's rank it. So who's kind of best and who's last, and then we'll publish it and show the whole team. And then all of a sudden, Mandy over here wants to beat Gemma over here because she wants to play in the lineup above them and things like this. And I think it's just that they're athletes for a reason. They're competitive, and if you can make them realize this, then it's only going to help them grow as well. And I think that's the same with sprinting, jumping, any sort of test. If you can make it some sort of a competition, power output, if you're using VBT, if you're doing jump squats, like publish elite. We've got a pretty neat device with the elite form. We can publish our data on the TV screens, and it updates as you go through the session. So if we're doing jump squats, then all of a sudden one girl has got, I don't know, 500 watts, let's just say. Then somebody else has got 550. Then she jumps above them automatically in the leaderboard, and they can see that. They get that instant feedback, and especially with I think kind of the athletes we're dealing with today, they're very much like dopamine driven. They want that instant gratification and instant feedback and stuff like that's fantastic. Like they used to just flick on their Instagram and seeing what they want to see because it's their feed. They used to go in on Amazon and order what they want when they want it. And you couldn't do this 10, 20 years ago. So now they're used to that instant gratification, instant feedback. And that's kind of our way of doing that for them, using that TV monitor to pop up their results, posting testing results to the group chat to keep things competitive so they can see how they're doing. And I think it's the more information you can give them in an understandable and digestible manner, then the better off you're going to be.
Yeah. I was actually going to mention the using competition and competitive drills to try and create that environment of enjoyment. And like you said, athletes are naturally competitive. So if we can bring that element of competition into certain drills, I think it enhances the enjoyment automatically without the athletes even knowing that they're doing what we actually want them to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an easy win as well. Like you say, they're naturally competitive. They want to be able to compete. So just kind of let them go. Like if we look at our like movement progressions and things like this, it's almost closed skills early on in the warm-up, some people might class as more boring. So we'll hit our base position, shuffle patterns, teach them how to use kind of the inside edge and et cetera, nail down what Franz Bosch might class as the key attractors of movement, so deepen those wells. So hopefully when we're under fatigue, those wells are deep enough to still be robust to the stresses of the environment, and then let them loose in fun, games, play for 10 minutes or whatever it might be, however much time you've got. Explore the fluctuators of the movement, the stuff that's going to be very unstable typically, that's going to get thrown at them in different games and stuff like this, and let them fail and learn from that failure. And like I say, from failure comes adaptation, and it's just this big cycle at the end of the day.
Last question. Anything that you have learned or realized over the last few months that sort of challenged your conventional beliefs to elite athlete development?
I wouldn't say necessarily over the last kind of few months, but it's became even more apparent over the last few months in terms of like what we talked about earlier with strength. I knew it was kind of not as important as what we thought it was in terms of having high levels of maximum strength. And when we change direction or sprint, there's like 5 times ground reaction forces, like 7 times muscular forces or whatever it is. And it's all specific to a certain time constraint, obviously. So chasing those numbers in the weight room isn't as important as I once thought it was. And I think that in the last few months has been kind of proven to me in how we've managed to get the girls to still PR in all their jumps and performance tests after they haven't touched a barbell for so long. So I think, like I said, strength's important, but how important is it really? That's kind of something that's really became like apparent to myself. And I think the value actually as well of single leg training, that was one thing we did do a lot. I'm not saying don't barbell back squat or whatever, but I think there's actually value in true single leg training in terms of like single leg pistol squats or skater squats, things like that. Obviously split squats, I don't know if that's a true single leg because your back foot's still on the floor. But I think there's a lot of value in that versus things like back squats and stuff like that. And I've always thought that single leg training was obviously very important, but in the past, one of my main reasons for not actually using it as much as I did, don't get me wrong, there was always an element of that, but was actually time, because you're essentially doubling the length of a set if you have to go both legs and then some. That was my main thing. So I kind of came to the conclusion of, now we need to just do more single leg training now and stuff like this. And I don't get me wrong, we still load bilaterally for our main lift, but a lot of the main kind of contribution or makeup of the program is now single leg.
Yeah.
Single leg movement, sorry.
Yeah. Awesome. Kris, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time, appreciate your openness, knowledge, and yeah, good to connect.
Absolutely, Robin. Thank you very much for having me on, mate. Greatly appreciate it, and good to chat.
Good to chat. We'll chat soon.